Leveraging Local Control Accountability Plans to Drive Effective Change, a webinar by Children Now and Pivot Learning Partners.
Introduce the folks who will be speaking to you today. It includes myself. My name is Samantha Tran. Again, I'm the Senior Director for Education Policy here at Children Now, and I help oversee our education policy work, which has included the local control funding formula. Prior to coming to Children Now, I actually worked for many years at the California School Boards Association, where I worked with regulatory bodies and policymakers, and then provided direct support and assistance to school board members and superintendents up and down the state as they were implementing policy. And then prior to that, at EdSource for a little while, doing research and writing. Also joining us today, which I'm really excited about, is Megan Sweet. Megan is the Director for Education Finance over at Pivot Learning Partners. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Pivot, they're a nonprofit organization that provides direct assistance to school districts up and down the state and has been doing some really innovative work around finance. Prior to joining Pivot, Megan actually had many years of experience actually working directly with kids as a teacher, and then in a district office doing the work around enrollment and program placement. In addition, she has her doctorate in a subject that is actually very closely aligned to this, which is about how education reform can connect and support student achievement. In addition, another member of our team here at Children Now is joining us, Eduardo Aguilar. Eduardo has been leading all of our efforts at Children Now to support community groups and districts as they're thinking about how to implement this new process at the local level, creating local control and accountability plans. Eduardo comes to Children Now with a little bit of experience working actually in Sac City Unified School District as a district staffer helping to oversee programming for kids. And then prior to that, had many years of experience actually organizing community and in particular working with youth to engage in public policy decisions. So he comes with kind of both of those lenses, which is really exciting because that's a lot about what we're going to talk today, is the district perspective as well as the community perspective when we think about this new opportunity. So a little bit about what we're hoping to that you take away from today's conversation. Some specific takeaways. First, we want to ground the conversation in what we see as being some of the overarching themes that create this new opportunity under the LCAP. And then do some LCAP 101, so just some basic grounding so that we all have the same context as we're having the conversation. And then most importantly, we're going to dive into the actual work and try and paint a picture around the year-round process that is this opportunity at the local level. And we're really framing it as the seasons of community engagement, planning, and budgeting, because there are these external timelines and internal timelines that will really drive the work, and that happens in phases throughout the year, and they tag pretty nicely with the different seasons in the year. The other strategy that we're going to use as we're going through this webinar is I'm going to be providing kind of the overall narrative to kind of connect the dots for having the conversation. And then we really do want to lift up these two complementary voices in the work. One is that of district leaders, and Megan will really own that voice around what district personnel can be thinking about in planning and preparing and doing the hard work of pulling these plans together. Eduardo will be owning the voice of community and what community members can be thinking about and preparing and doing the hard work of engaging in this effort locally. So as you hear their voices, that's what they're bringing to bear. And so with that, I think we'll launch right in to some of the content. So what are the two big ideas that we want to convey? First and foremost, that this really is a fundamental shift in the way schools can engage in community engagement, planning, and budget and implementation, and that through a coherent approach, one that is really grounded in this kind of continuous improvement philosophy, that we have a real opportunity to impact the lives of kids, and that we can think about the outcomes we're trying to achieve and back map from that and use the outcomes for kids as our kind of guiding star as we're doing the work, which historically in California we've not had that opportunity readily available, just given how command and control the historical finance system had been. And so it was much more challenging to create a coherent approach at the local level. And so there is this opportunity right now. Related to that, the work is not happening in a vacuum. It is very much connected to budget timelines at the state level, budget timelines at the local level, how you do good planning and engagement work, and those come in phases. So we're really going to try and lift that up and then be very tactical about what you can think about and what you can do in each of those phases. So a little bit of LCAP 101. The hope here is that this really does become a living document, that it is something that helps guide the work day in and day out. I think all of us, you know, if you've been working with schools and or organizations and businesses, have had that experience where you develop a plan, you do the work, you write it on a piece of paper, everyone feels good about it, and then it gets bound and put on a shelf, and maybe you revisit it a year later if you have to, and that doesn't always happen either. And there is the potential that that could happen around the LCAP unless we breathe life into it. And we want to make the case that there really is a benefit to breathing life into this process. And I want to start a little bit with the community engagement piece. There have been thankfully, a lot of good conversation throughout the state about the importance of community engagement. And you know, we're grateful for that because it does create this real opportunity. And there's lots of ways that people talk about it. Some will come to it with the perspective of, well, it's in the law. There's certain actual requirements that you have to consult with parent committees. You have to have at least 2 hearings before you adopt the plan. So that's kind of one vantage point on community engagement, and there's truth in that. Another vantage point as it relates to community engagement is that the end user, the students who are receiving their education, the parents returning their children over to a teacher and the public school system to be educated, have some inherent need and desire to engage with the system to build trust, and so there's a mutual understanding. We'll talk a lot about that today, and so again, I think there's a lot of truth in that. The other piece that I would put out there as a benefit of community engagement actually goes back to an old story. It's in the Hindu tradition, the Buddhist tradition, the idea of a bunch of folks sitting around a table who had never seen an elephant before, and they all wanted to know what it looked like. And it just so happened that in the next room there was an elephant in the dark, and so each of the stakeholders went in to determine what the elephant looked like. And so one touched the ear and they said, oh, it's a fan, or it's like a fan. Another touched the tail and said, oh, this is kind of like a snake or a rope. Another touched the leg and it looks like a tree. And they all had a piece of that reality. They all had some grounding in what an elephant was, but none of them could see the whole picture. And we would argue that the task of educating our kids is a complex endeavor, and that we each have a piece of that puzzle, but none of us have the full picture. And so community engagement is really that opportunity to get a better grounding in what the reality is for kids and communities, and to think through how to best serve them. So as we think about communities and stakeholders and engaging them, the other suggestion we would make is to reframe in our mind what we mean by education experts. There are many of us who've worked in schools and in districts, who've worked in and around policy, who normally get that title of an education expert, and there is expertise in that. In addition, parents have a very strong expertise in knowing what they want for their kids. Students know what's going to engage and excite them. Teachers understand what they're engaging in every day, and so how do we think about that expertise and bring it into our planning and budgeting cycle to really have a full picture? And related to that, and in order to do that effectively, this can't be a one-time event. If we are just doing the minimum aspects of the law, you can check the box and say you did community engagement, but many of us would argue that that is not sufficient and deep enough to really lift up those multiple voices. It's an opportunity to build trust and relationships that can benefit kids. So once as you're doing this engagement process, for all of us to do our work effectively, it is absolutely helpful to have structures that then help make sure we're in alignment and working in the same direction, that we are harnessing all of that potential and are aligned in our strategies. And so what the LCAP creates is this opportunity to do strategic planning and budgeting and investing in kids. And so there are some core components of what that means that are grounded both in the law and also grounded in what we know about good planning and budgeting. And so what are those components? Here are the key ones that we'll be talking about as we move through the rest of this 101 and then touching on throughout the presentation. First, within the context of the law, California did something extraordinary. We actually set priority areas that were very broad-based and holistic. They honored the long-time tradition of saying that academic achievement and attainment is critical, so making sure that we are making sure kids are on progress towards outcomes, and that's an important piece. But we also identified the need to make sure we're looking at other holistic outcomes, like the environment in which kids are attending school, whether or not they feel engaged, whether or not parents feel engaged, whether or not they're coming to school, so chronic absenteeism, which is something that relates to how often a kid comes to class, whether it's 10% or more that they're missing per year. And so these important indicators are priorities that the state has listed up that within the context of the LCAP we need to refer back to as we're developing our goals. As related to that in the strategic planning process, it's really important that you identify those goals and that those goals are collectively owned. And in the context of the statute, there are some key requirements. One, that they have to address all the priority areas. Two, that there are 3-year goals, and that each of those years there are some annual outcomes that the district and the community are owning in terms of what's trying to be achieved. And that they're connected to particular actions and services that will impact all students, and then also specifically impact subgroups of students. So our high-need students that are generating these additional dollars, our English learners, our low-income students, our foster youth. So as we're thinking about goals, these are important elements to incorporate. The goals also can, and I would argue should, be tailored to meet the unique needs of individual school sites. And we know that within a given district, schools are at various places and have various instances that are happening in any given year. In addition, we know that subgroups of students may be, from a kind of general perspective, at various places along the continuum in terms of outcomes. And so thinking about those differences and trying to be attentive to goals that meet those unique needs is important. And then related to that, identifying outcomes that are tailored. And the statute, the LCAP statute, in addition to having kind of these holistic priority areas, actually lists out a number of key metrics that there's the expectation that will be incorporated into the plan. So, for example, assessment scores, graduation rates, whether or not kids have access to career technical education or career pathways, whether or not doing student surveys to see how kids are experiencing their education, parents, how they're experiencing the school system. So a lot of these different metrics are part of the statute and need to be incorporated into the plan. And then the next key piece is where is the piece that is clear why the LCAP is so different, because we have had opportunities in the past to create broad goals, to say what we're going to achieve for our kids in terms of outcomes, to use different data sources to try and match progress. But LCFF creates this new opportunity to then take all of the existing resources that you have and really think through how you're going to use them differently in alignment with those goals and in service of student outcomes. And so there are some key best practices, and Megan will get into this in more detail as we go through the actual presentation, but having clear alignment between the approach that you're going to invest in, the programs and services, with your goals, having a very clear strategy in mind, that the way you're making those investments are reflective of the feedback and the priorities from your various stakeholders, and that you're very clear about how you're using your resources, both the resources that are generated by high-need kids, your supplemental concentration dollars, as well as all the funding that you're using to achieve the goals that you've outlined. And so, again, here's where the real opportunity is to connect the dots internally within a district. And a new piece of the work that is happening for the first time this year is then reporting out on progress. And so We went through the process last year of developing the initial LCAPs and developed a plan. Districts are beginning to implement that work, and we have to be mindful that the implementation really is just happening now, even as we begin the community engagement and planning for next year. But as part of that process, we're going to have to reflect back and say, okay, what worked, what didn't, what early things are we finding out, what adjustments might we make, what progress has happened or not happened, and how does that impact how we reflect on the work. And so that's going to be a new component that districts and communities will be experiencing for the first time this year. So that's a general overview of the LCAP and some of the key components. Before we dive into the seasons of the budget, I just want to note on the front end that we're going to spend a whole lot of time talking about fall and winter and a little bit in spring too, because it's our assertion that it's important to front load this work considerably. It reminds me of the Einstein quote, if I had an hour and to solve a problem, I'd spend that first 55 minutes just thinking about the problem and understanding the multiple facets of that problem, or in this case, understanding the complexity in which we educate our kids and how we might serve them and what lessons we've learned from the past and how that might impact what we do next. And so that there's a lot of time for reflection and preparation, and then putting pen to paper is an important part of the process, but it is evoked based on all of that previous work. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the fall, and I'm going to ground a little bit about what we're trying to accomplish, and then I'm going to turn it over to Megan to get into some of the deeper work. The fall really is a time for both reflection and preparation. We have this moment where we can look back at the LCAP that was probably just approved by your county and begin thinking about how you would then implement that plan now that the school year has begun in full swing. And at the same time also reflect back on your engagement process. What worked, what didn't work, and begin planning for this upcoming year. And so along those lines, I'm going to turn it over to Megan, who will give some ideas on that front.
Hi, everybody. So for each season, we're also going to just give a general overview of some of the things that might be happening on a district budgeting calendar and how those connect to the LCAP. So again, situating this work in several different timelines and processes at the same time so we can understand what might be driving some of the work. In the beginning of the school year in fall, the first thing the districts do is they count their students. They do this so they can get a clear number of the actual students that are attending their schools, so they know how many kindergartners, how many first graders, how many English learners, how many high school students, so they can refine their budget and align their staffing to the actual students that arrive at school in the fall. Some of the work that connects to that, to the LCAP, is that the budgets within the LCAP will be made final based on those number of students. Since under LCFF, districts are funded based on the number of students by grade and by those student subgroups. We need to get a really clear number and then adjust the budgets accordingly. And that will then mean that the districts can finalize their allocations that are outlined in the LCAP and in other plans reflective of the students that they have. From a district point of view, starting in July or August is a good time to start looking at the LCAP and developing an implementation plan. One of the first things the districts want to do is look at it with fresh eyes. After having submitted the LCAP in July, the beginning of July, district leaders need to come back and take a look at that plan and start to unpack it and develop an implementation plan. How are we going to actually accomplish all of what's included in the plan? They'll also want to assess whether or not any emerging information might impact the implementation of the plan. A good example of that could be enrollment that I mentioned just previously. If the district has a larger percentage of a certain kind of students, say more kindergartners than expected and fewer high school students, they might need to adjust their plan to reflect the needs of the students that are attending their schools. They also need to assign the goal area to specific staff to ensure that all goals are being addressed. Within the LCAP itself, it's quite complicated. We want to make sure that each goal has a person within the district office that knows it's their goal to manage and monitor so that nothing gets lost in the course of the year. And finally, a major outcome would be to calendar milestones and check in on implementation and to collect data. So for each one of those goals, map out what it's going to take to look like it. Do that backwards map, figure out where you plan to be or aspire to be at the end of the year, and what is that going to take at different moments of time during the course of the year to realize that. And also at the same time, map out those moments when we can collect data. Data related to the LCAPs is going to emerge at different times of the year. Already in the fall, the district has some data from the last school year, such as enrollment data, they can start to look at. But then it'll be emerging over the course of the year as the LCAP gets implemented. And we need to make sure that we're checking in on data and collecting it as we go.
So similar to what the processes that are being engaged in by the district and reviewing the LCAP and seeing how things kind of shaped out for during the previous planning year, community groups can start doing a similar process that allows for them to kind of see what did actually make it into the LCAP. And for those of you that haven't had the pleasure of working with the LCAP yet, it is actually there's some improvements being made to the template this year that you'll hopefully find helpful in being able to see the alignment between the goals, actions, and investments being made by districts. Those of you that had the dubious pleasure of working with the LCAP that was submitted this year, you probably had experienced some difficulty with figuring out how all of the dots connected, and you're not alone in that. But know that there are some improvements that will be present within this next iteration of what the template would look like. And so look forward to those pieces. One of the other steps you can take as a community group or as a parent is to begin looking at how districts or how school sites specifically are looking at the types of, or what kind of improvements each school site is looking to do themselves. And so every school site is required to submit a single plan for student achievement. This is a document that is independent of the LCAP and still a requirement for school sites to create. And so it's an opportunity to actually dive into a similar document, or at least a similarly focused document that is looking at how a school site is really kind of capturing what the needs are and what types of investments it would like to make at the site level to improve student outcomes. And so if you were to take a look at one of these documents, it'd be an opportunity for you to take a look at any innovative programming that your school site is incorporating into its instructional practices. So that way you can make sure that as you're engaged on the LCAP discussions at the district level, that those types of programs don't get lost in the mix. It's a huge opportunity within the LCAP to really highlight those best practices and in some ways cement them into what the district is committing to do for the subsequent year. So as you're going through the SIP says, so these are the single plan for student achievement, as you're going through that plan, being able to really kind of extract those promising practices that you're seeing make an impact on your campus and bringing that to the district level discussion. The other thing you'll want to do, and this kind of goes back to the previous slide, is as early as you can, begin at least trying to find out when some upcoming dates are, including meetings or just what the calendar looks like for when the district will begin engaging community partners in the development of the LCAP. Similarly, though, this is the first year of implementation, so you have two simultaneous processes taking place. You have, the review and getting geared up for this upcoming year's development of the LCAP, but at the same time, you have the implementation that's taking place. And so your district may have two separate processes that are underway currently, and so any information you can gather and share out with your colleagues and peers to be able to keep them abreast of what's going on at the district and to help support the broader engagement efforts is definitely something we can start doing now. Similarly to that, you want to really begin knowing who to talk to in the process. And so this includes getting an understanding of who your board members are, making sure you at least know the superintendent's name, and if there are any associate superintendents in your district, seeing if there are any that are responsible for specific aspects of the LCAP so that you know who to talk to if you have a specific ask that you want to bring to the table. Similarly, some districts have found the need to designate a specific LCAP coordinator, and so some districts have actually embedded this into their plans, and so this may be the first year that your district has a designated person that is solely responsible for helping to coordinate the LCAP efforts. They're not responsible for developing it, but they're responsible for helping to bring all the pieces and stakeholders together. So it'd be great to begin doing a quick map of who the folks are in your district that will be involved and will be leading the process at the district level. Similarly, at the very least, you can start talking to your principals at your local schools to begin seeing what processes they're setting up to help feed into the broader district processes. Also, you want to begin to connect with organizations that are in the community that were previously engaged in the effort that took place the previous year, or that are looking to be engaged. And so being able to connect with them and help to connect them to the process would be another beneficial step you can start taking. And all of this really comes back to just building relationships. So, one of the things that we know helps to turn around schools and student outcomes is the ability for people to come together. And just as Sam had outlined earlier with the elephant, nobody has all the answers, but together we actually are able to bring a more comprehensive picture that better serves our students. So really, the fall is a great time to begin to get a lay of the land and to start making those connections and building those relationships.
Wonderful. And from a district's point of view, it's a good time during the fall, to look back at how last year's process went. LCAP brings this new opportunity for us to, as we've been mentioning with the elephants, to bring different viewpoints and different voices to the table to really create equitable opportunities for students. And one of those beginning places is to ensure that we're giving equitable opportunities to have people's voices be shared and their ideas be shared during the engagement process. So some things that district leaders can do right at the beginning of the year is to really go back and look at how last year went. How did the first process go? Given that LCFS was new and districts were learning about it and building the plans as they were being built themselves, it was a very messy time. How did that process go? What are some things that the district can feel good about? And what are some areas that the district would like to go deeper on and improve on for this year, now that we have a little bit of a better sense of what stakeholder engagement could look like? Another good thing to do is to look at the LCAP itself and see if you can find any tangible examples of how community engagement influenced the LCAP. This is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, if you can reflect that back to your community members, they're going to feel like their voices were heard, and it's going to promote a more successful engagement process in the second year. It will also help to validate the voices that were in the room and help us all to see that everyone does have important voices to share. Also, listen for any feedback district leaders might have gotten about the process. So it's very possible that a district leader could be feeling very confident and that the engagement process last year was really successful. But if you check around with different community members, especially community members that you engage with on a regular basis, hear what's being said and talked about that process from parents, from stakeholders throughout the district, and see if maybe there's going to be some different points of view and learn about that. Get some feedback and see how the process can be improved for this year. And finally, take a look at what stakeholders actually engaged last year and what groups might have been underrepresented. So it's very possible that the district had a very robust engagement process last year, had several different meetings that were really well attended. But it's now time to take a look and see whether or not those folks that showed up at those meetings, were they representative of the district? Were there voices such as students, families, subgroups, staff, or teachers that weren't represented as well? And how can the district deepen and broaden their process this year to ensure that those stakeholders are included?
And so a lot of what Megan just shared, again, carries over to the community level track that we're encouraging you all to engage in. And so really, this is an opportunity for those of you that had the opportunity to engage at the district level or at the site level in the development of your LCAP, is to really reflect on what worked last year so you can lift those promising practices up for your district so that make sure to repeat them this year, but also identify where improvements could be made. And so finding those opportunities to provide that constructive feedback and saying this worked out, but this could have definitely been done better, and offering some suggestions that you feel could help with that improvement would be very beneficial for the dialogue. Also, being able to go back, if you still have any copies of them, but any materials, any resources that were printed or made available on the website for the school district that you found to be very helpful in informing your engagement in the development of the LCAP. So really being able to lift up those as good examples of things that should be replicated this year, as well as identifying where some information gaps existed. So if you felt that there was great information on any one particular area and you felt really empowered to engage on that area, but that there was an absence of information in another area, lift that up so that way your district can begin to either develop those resources or begin reaching out to folks that have that access to that information. And also just begin thinking about what the district can be doing to make you feel empowered overall to just continue to engage and to really see yourself as an ambassador in the process, because the district has, despite its size, it tends to have very limited reach into the community, and a lot of that is based on the relationships that we have with individuals. And so being able to empower you as an individual, as an organization, to tap into your network, to engage and bring more insight into the development of the LCAP is a huge support you can provide to your district.
Wonderful. So once we've done our review as a district and developed an implementation timeline for our LCAP and developed that engagement calendar, it's time to share that information back out again. So just like we're creating an implementation timeline, we need to also develop an engagement calendar with a clear scope and sequence that is inclusive and aligns with the district LCAP implementation timeline. It'll also be influenced by other things that are happening in the district, such as the budgeting calendar that we're choosing to organize around today. It could be the board meetings, other plans that are being implemented at the same time. So make sure that this calendar is aligned. The second thing to do is to really communicate that back out again. In order to really make sure that we get the most out of the engagements, we need to support community and stakeholders to understand what the scope and sequence of engagement is, which meetings are going to be ones that are going to be more informational, which ones are going to be ones where stakeholder voice is going to be asked for, especially around specific topics, and start each meeting with that information. So set the context each time you engage with community to help them to understand where this meeting falls in the larger engagement plan. And finally, create a really positive first experience. Districts, especially over the last few years where we've had so many years of budget cuts and had to make some really hard choices, we're all entering into the conversation, having had some really painful community engagement meetings or meetings in the past around having to make budget cuts or cuts to programs. And it's going to take some time for us to build that trust back and to create a new way of working together. And that means that each experience we have needs to be intentional about it, and we really need to try and set the stage for how we're going to work together. The first kind of community engagement process that we're recommending for the first of the year is an informational one. To be sure that all stakeholders have the information they need to be able to successfully engage in the rest of the engagement process during the course of the year. This first meeting really needs to be one where we make sure that folks understand the contents of the LCAP, of the district implementation plan, and the community engagement plan is. And these meetings should be ones that are also tailored to your specific constituents that are coming. Your informational meetings that you're having for site principals, teachers, and other district staff, for example, need to be focused on what their role is in implementing the LCAP and how their work and their responsibilities might shift or change to be able to realize the goals and the visions within that LCAP. Your stakeholder informational meetings with students and parents, for example, will be much more specific around what is going to be different or changing at a student's school or within the district based on the contents of that LCAP, and how students and parents and other stakeholders are going to be engaged and involved throughout the course of the year.
So now that you've gone through this reflection process and preparation process, in the winter there's the chance to really start diving in with more concrete information, which we'll talk a little bit about. The main goals for this season are to help connect the dots between the LCAP that's happening, that was already adopted, the goals and activities, any other plans that were kind of left out of the mix, how you create alignment and coherence around the work moving forward, and to really get into working with your community and engaging in that feedback process and prioritization process begins in the winter.
Wonderful. And back with where we are in the budgeting process for this year, in towards the late fall, early winter, within districts, they're going to be projecting the number of students for the next school year, which means they're going to make an estimate of how many kindergartners through 12th graders each district expects they're going to be having in the district, how many English learners, other subgroups that might need specific support. They're going to be making an educated guess. They're going to do this because then they're going to match that to the draft budget that the state will release in January, providing some insight into how school districts will be funded for the upcoming school year. And once once those projections are completed and there's a draft budget that can be used to guide the projections, then the district will develop a draft budget on what the district expects they'll be receiving for the next year. The connection to the LCAP is to review the LCAP plan and to begin a process of developing a draft plan for the upcoming school year. So now is when we're going to start doing a both and. We're going to continue to maintain and implement the first year LCAP while we enter into a process of revisioning and revising the second one. The first thing that we recommend that districts do is to develop a vision for the change. Given the amount of time the districts had last year to learn about LCFF and LCAP and the requirements that will be need to be included within it, all basically happening from January to June of last year, districts didn't necessarily have the time to create or refine a vision for student achievement or to identify key strategies that they believe will support students to be successful. Districts also didn't necessarily connect their LCAPs to other existing plans that are in place, such as the Common Core Implementation Plan. Even district strategic plans were not necessarily aligned within the LCAP itself. So before moving forward, now's the time to do some of that work. And if you identify those things, it will help you to organize and drive the development of your revised version of your LCAP for the next school year. So the first thing to do to get that process started is to review data and lots of it. Look for the data that's contained within the LCAP itself. By this time of year, you will have had about 4 or 5 months of school passed. You'll be able to check in on student achievement data and other outcomes that the districts outlined in their LCAP that they wanted to be able to reach, and get a sense of how well the district is on track for reaching those goals. You also want to look for new and emerging data that might signal areas of need that might not have been included the first time around, or they're new pieces of information that have shifted or changed. The final thing you need to do is to engage with your community and see what they think. During the stakeholder engagement process, what we want to do is to also review the data with the stakeholders. This is with the elephant. Stakeholders have a different vision or a different take on the same source of data that district leaders might have, and we want to get that voice and that perspective included in the data analysis. We also want to share with them and kind of road test a draft vision and key strategies that the district believes will be the right ones to be able to support student achievement. So, for example, if the district, when they did their data analysis, identified that student attendance is a real problem within the district, maybe one of the key strategies that the district has identified that they want to focus on is improving student attendance, both chronic absence rates and maybe truancy or tardiness in the morning. They want to share that with the community to see if that feels like the right strategy and to gather some input. Finally, when you're engaging with the community and getting that next set of information about what the goals and the priorities should be for the upcoming school year, you want to make sure that you ask the right kinds of questions. Last year we saw a lot of examples of districts as they're getting ready for LCFS, where they asked really broad or general questions about, say, the eight state priority areas in general, or they didn't provide enough context to make the questions meaningful for various stakeholders. So you want to do is you want to try and take some time before you go out there and engage with stakeholders to make sure that you're asking questions that are going to be broad enough that you can get a lot of different kinds of feedback, but narrow enough that it's going to be targeted toward the areas that you feel are most important or are going to give you the most impact in terms of your engagement.
And so kind of building off of that, and we really can't emphasize enough, taking the time to craft the types of questions that are going to yield information that will help drive the conversation. Developing the effective engagement process really requires that there be transparency at the core of it. And so this means that information is provided far in advance of when meetings are taking place, specifically around meetings where decisions are actively taking place. So it's not just a feedback session, but exactly when the board will be voting on something, or if there are the parent advisory committee meetings or the English language advisory committee meetings, when those will be taking place and if public participation is allowed. So being able to really provide a deep level of clarity on that. The next piece is really the access to information. And though we didn't see too much of it, what we found were that a lot of districts that provided information to the public were literally just providing links on their websites to documents created on the policy side of the LCAP and LCFF discussion, which were not necessarily accessible to parents that aren't deeply engaged with the education policy arena, and so it may not have been the most accessible set of information that they could have been connected with. And so taking some time to find resources that do allow for your community to engage is key. Making sure that along with the questions that you're providing a structured yet flexible approach to engaging folks in the discussion. And by structured, really it is about being intentional about the questions that you're asking, but providing the flexibility within those sessions to be able to allow people to bring in some out-of-the-box thinking. And so really finding space to create openness in the dialogue and finding tools that allow folks to really bring in some innovative thoughts into the process. And finally, really making sure that in the engagement effort that you're really focusing on creating linguistic accessibility, and that both pertains to making sure that you're not using jargon, and so any kind of abbreviation that folks may not be familiar with, that you even have a table of contents that is just distributed at every meeting that provides a quick reference sheet for folks to understand what LCFF means, what LCAP means, is a great thing to incorporate into your meetings and engagement efforts moving forward. And then to make sure that there is translation available for communities that need it to ensure that they are effectively engaged and not muted in the conversation. Along the lines of continuing to gather feedback, you want to make sure that you provide multiple points for people to connect with your efforts. So a survey is a great kind of general way to gather information, making sure, of course, to distill the information or set it up in a way that allows for you to understand where it's coming from in terms of general groups, if it's student, if it's parent, if it's staff. It's helpful because that'll help you in, as you're engaging in a discussion, to understand what those specific constituencies are seeing and what they'd like to see moving forward. Being able to make sure that you provide clarity around what the intended use of that information is, as well as the anonymity that is afforded to those that do provide that information, so that they don't feel that they're essentially silenced, because if they submit something online, it's going to be tracked back to their computer and it could come back to bite them, which is a very real concern that folks have shared. And so you want to make sure that you're providing absolute clarity in terms of how people can submit that information, whether there is anonymity that is afforded them through the tool that you're using, and how it will be aggregated and shared out. And finally, remember, again, the questions are incredibly useful in terms of helping to get information that will inform how that process moves forward. Moving on to some additional pieces to consider in terms of how to engage as a community member in these processes. Know that you are an expert. You are an expert in what your kid needs. You are an expert in what your school, how your school can continue to improve outcomes for your student as well as for students in their class and for the broader school. So know that you bring value to the dialogue from the get-go. So don't feel that because you're not completely up to speed on the policy that you don't have something to bring to the table. So make sure that you feel that confidence as you're walking in. Also, it's important to note that despite the big influx of dollars that are coming into schools, we're still kind of operating in scarcity. So districts are still nowhere near the level of funding that we know is necessary to ensure effective outcomes moving forward, but we're creeping up. And so the goal is really to work together with districts to find how to leverage existing dollars to improve outcomes. Make sure that you are working with folks to incorporate ideas that could be beneficial, and really engage at any decision-making opportunity that is accessible to you, and continue to work collaboratively with the district to ensure that responsive opportunities are made available to yourself and peers moving forward.
So by the end of this phase, or this season of the LCAP development, what we want to be able to do is to start to prioritize the feedback and the different sources of information that the district has been engaging in, to be able to do a few things. One of them is to make sure that the district is aligned with the transition plan for Common Core state standards. Be sure that they've addressed or considered any existing or most urgent student needs within their vision and key strategies. Make sure that what they're moving forward with is well aligned with all other district plans, that there isn't an LCAP, and then there's also a Common Core plan, and then there's also an LEA plan, and each one contains different kinds of information. And they also want to look for any consistent themes from the stakeholder engagement, feedback, areas of need that are coming out of that engagement. And the goal at the end of this phase is to have that final vision and the key strategies that will guide for LCAP refinement. So you want to be able to know pretty clearly what the student needs are, what the data is telling us in terms of progress so far on the LCAP that was being in the process of implemented this year, and what those key strategies are that are coming out from all the other district plans.
So then we move into spring, and this is really, we started very broadly, kind of big picture, preparation, reflection, narrowing it down, getting feedback, and beginning to prioritize. And now we're really getting to the point where we're drafting, we're sharing those drafts, we're revising it, we're repeating it. It's a very much an iterative process. And so the goals for this season is to do that work, to refine your goals and your metrics and indicators, to begin selecting the activities that you're going to fund, to make sure that the budget is aligned, and then providing those reviews in a formal way to the school board as they go through their governing role and their process. And so the spring is an intense season for refinement, and I'm going to turn it over to Megan, who will talk a little bit about that.
Wonderful. So what's happening from a budget calendar point of view during this time of year is that certificated teachers and other positions are being finalized, and those layoff notices are required by March. In May, or around that time of year, the districts start to revise their budget based on the revised budget that gets released by the state. So there was a draft budget that was released in January. The revised budget that comes out in May, the districts revise their budgets to align with that. And then some other budget decisions for non-staff needs might start to get clarified along with the LCAP. So the things that are happening in LCAP development at the same time is all this kind of staffing and budget kind of reorganizing, as that the district will determine its proportionality and LCAP funding levels for the next school year. They'll review the final budget that's been outlined in the LCAPs and the school site plans with stakeholders to make sure that the budget that's being envisioned is one that is aligned with stakeholder expectations. And they're going to gain school board approval of the budget in the LCAP, the final versions that are going to be created. So identifying what strategies will guide your plan is a really important part. So assuming that at the end of the winter time, districts have been able to identify their key strategies and their vision, and you want to start to organize the next version of the LCAP around those same strategies so that a clear picture starts to emerge. So some questions you might want to ask of yourself as you're developing your LCAP at this phase is, are all the goals, metrics, and actions from last year's LCAP still valid, or do they need to be adjusted? So are there things that were in the first LCAP that no longer align with the key strategies and activities that have been identified through the engagement process this year? Are there new goals, metrics, or actions that should be added based on emerging data, feedback from the community, or that increased clarity now that the district has those key strategies in mind? And then finally, how can we align our budget to realize our goals? And again, I want to emphasize that LCFF and LCAP is a real opportunity for us to move towards more equitable spending and more equitable outcomes for students. So this is the time to really think about that from a district lens and start to organize and synthesize your LCAP under some broad activities. So the process that's happening during the spring is to take those priorities, the goals, and the actions that have been gathered and reviewed, both from the existing LCAP that's being implemented, from the data analysis that's been conducted, the community engagement, increased clarity about the budget for the upcoming school year, and you want to draft an LCAP and a budget. So during this phase, we're really in the refine and finalize phase, where we take those key strategies and goals, develop a draft LCAP and budget, and take it out to the community to gather feedback. And to different stakeholders and different constituents will have different points of views on that element, and make sure that they can give their feedback on the LCAP is, share it with the board, and then finalize the LCAP by the end of June, right before summer starts.
And so even though the spring still presents an opportunity for you as a community member or parent to elevate some investments that you'd like to see appear within the LCAP, know that a lot of that work really is does require for you to engage in the fall. But nevertheless, once you're in the spring, as you're continuing to engage, it's an opportunity to kind of see from the drafts what might end up in the final version, and seeing if the investments and actions that you were advocating for appear. And it's an opportunity to continue to have those conversations with folks. At the very least, we'd encourage you to make sure that if the investment or service that you're looking to include within the LCAP doesn't appear within the investments themselves, that it appear within the community input section, so that it can at least be documented in some way in there. Also, as was pointed out earlier, during the spring is when districts are really finalizing their budgets and seeing what they have to work with, and it is not a time where they will be reviewing their staffing for the upcoming year. Know that it's an opportunity for you to kind of, at least on the surface level, be able to see if there are asks that you're advocating for that don't align with the budget currently. And so being able to use that as an opportunity to grow from. And then finally, really making sure that the LCAP is comprehensive and captures the conversations that you've been a part of and the agreements that you know have been made along the way.
Great, and so then we start moving to the summer, and the big takeaways from the summertime is really this is when the plan is adopted and it's been reviewed by the county and approved, and the implementation work begins to connect the dots between the planning efforts and the staff that are going to be leading the work and how those programs will play out.
So during this time of year, in July, a final budget gets released by the state, and the district is going to match through that final budget allocation. And again, are going to be able to start to spend towards that. The connection to the LCAP is that the district budgets get matched the student allocation based on the expected students, so I kind of named already. And the budgets in the LCAP and funding allocations are revised based on county office feedback. So July 1st, those budgets and LCAPs get submitted, and then they get feedback from their county offices to refine or revise it. It's also a good time to turn attention to next year. So even though the LCAPs have been completed, and it's definitely been a long year of lots of good work, it's a good time to engage with the county office and make sure that the LCAP for next year has been revised, and if there's any feedback, to get them a good sense of what it is and why that feedback's coming. It's also a good time to update and refine the implementation plan and engagement processes to match the new plan. So there's no need to start over again in the fall. Look at what you created now that it's fresh still, and make some adjustments for the upcoming school year. Look at the LCAP and see if appropriate staff are on board to do the work. If certain areas have been identified that might represent new or different or deepening work from what the district did in the previous year, now's a good time to make sure those staff are on board and get them up to date. And then make the most of the summer to get the year started strong. Make sure that your professional development plans are aligned and in place. You're starting to engage with your community members and helping them to make sense of the LCAP.
And so really, this is the wash, rinse, and repeat kind of section for community members. And so you'll notice that from the slide, really the two key takeaways from the slide is get a copy of the final version that was submitted by your district by the July 1st deadline. But know that the county has until August 15th to send them feedback to us, mid-August, and a final version is adopted or approved in September. And so make sure that you're kind of following that process and that the district is doing its best to keep its community abreast of where they are in that process if a final version has been adopted by the county, so that you are able to make sure as you're engaging and gearing up for the fall, you have that final version available